Hercule Poirot and the Perfume That Killed Dawn. Chapter 1. An Aroma Among the Dead. It was a cool morning on the coast of Deauville when the first ray of sun painted the windows of the Hôtel des Palmes gold. The servants moved discreetly, turning off lanterns, opening curtains, and preparing breakfast trays for the wealthy guests staying there. The sound of the sea was just a distant whisper. But in Suite 304, a different silence reigned, a dense, contained silence, as if time itself had decided not to move forward. Miss Élodie Marraine, personal maid of the famous Baroness Delphine d'Aubrac, pushed open the door with a trembling hand. He had called 3 times, as he always did, at 7 o'clock, unanswered. "Madam!" His voice was barely a thread. The room was dark. The Baroness, known in Paris not only for her immense fortune, but for her fierce personality and her collection of exotic perfumes, lay on the chaise longue next to the open window, still dressed in the purple silk kimono she usually wore to bed. His posture was elegant, almost as if he were sleeping, but his skin had an ashy tone. On the floor, a small cut crystal perfume bottle lay, broken, the liquid spilling out like a puddle of scented amber. The air smelled of musk, violet, and something else, something metallic, unpleasant, that did not combine with the usual exquisiteness of the Baroness's dressing table. Élodie screamed. Hours later, Inspector Morel of the French police closed the cover of his notebook with a displeased expression. "The probable cause, poisoning," he murmured to his assistant. "But the medical examiner still hasn't confirmed anything. There are no signs of struggle, no injuries. The window's open from inside, the door locked, no forced entry. Suicide, perhaps." Morel shook her head. "A woman like the Baroness does not take her own life wrapped in her gala kimono, not on the eve of announcing his new will, and not with that smile on his lips. Look good. It's like someone has tricked her, seduced her." And so, the assistant pointed to the broken bottle. "According to the maid, a new perfume, never seen before. Apparently, it arrived in the mail last night. No sender." The inspector sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Too many secrets in this hotel, too many eyes that saw but will not speak. That same afternoon, an elegant gentleman got off the train at the Trouville-Deauville station. Small, with a perfectly trimmed moustache, a pearl-grey coat, and an ivory cane that barely touched the ground with each calculated step. "Mon ami, I have received your telegram," he said, adjusting his gloves. "And now the case sounds interesting to me, literally." "Merci d'être venu, Monsieur Poirot," replied Inspector Morel, shaking his hand respectfully. "I confess that the scene disturbs me. It's unusually refined for a crime." Poirot cocked his head, curious. "Isn't refinement the best disguise for murder? Tell me more, s'il vous plaît." They walked together towards the hotel, while the sun was hidden behind soft clouds. Poirot listened in silence, as if each word were a note in a secret symphony. When he reached the lobby, his gaze was already scanning the details, the clocks, the perfectly aligned carpets, the buttons with dark circles, and when he went up to Suite 304, he stopped dead. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "Crime has good taste, and that, Inspector, is always the sign of a murderer with an ego." He leaned over the broken jar. Violet musk, and hydrogen cyanide, perhaps. How do you know?" Poirot smiled. "Because I've smelled it before, in another crime, years ago. But then they didn't hide it so well." He sat up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. Then he turned towards the door. "Gather all the guests who were present last night. I want to see their faces, because one of them, he has chosen a perfume too deadly to hide his lie." Chapter 2. The Guest Who Did Not Cry. The guests of the Hôtel des Palmes were summoned to the private tea-room on the second floor, a space decorated with floral tapestries and Louis XV armchairs that contrasted with the tension that was growing in the atmosphere. While the waiters discreetly served coffee, the faces of those present spoke more than any statement. Poirot entered with a leisurely step, his impeccable figure projecting authority without needing to raise his voice. Morel stood to his right, watching carefully. In front of them 6 people, each one with a reason for being there, none willing to speak first. Poirot raised an eyebrow and looked at them one by one. "Before I begin," he said, stroking the edge of his moustache, "permit me to express my condolences on the tragic death of the Baroness d'Aubrac. A distinguished woman, and I am told, feared in equal measure. A short break. We are not here to accuse," he continued in a gentle tone, "but to understand. And to understand, we must remember." His gaze fell on a middle-aged woman, dressed in an elegant black dress that did not cry mourning, but refinement. He was wearing dark glasses, even though he was indoors, and was holding an untouched glass of champagne. "Madame, are you?" She lowered her glasses slightly, revealing eyes of a disturbing green. Claudine de Verreuil, writer, friend, so to speak, of the deceased. "So to speak," Poirot repeated softly. "Didn't they get along? The Baroness didn't get along with anyone," Claudine answered without hesitation. "His company was a challenge, sometimes stimulating, often poisonous. But it was impossible to ignore her, like an expensive perfume that one hates, but that stays on the skin." Poirot did not look away. "Where were you last night between 9 and 11? "In the hotel library. With Mr. Lemoyne," he replied, calmly crossing his legs. "We were discussing the film adaptation of one of my novels. A conversation, believe me, more lethal than any bottle. The man in question, a tall, thin man with a Canadian accent, nodded with a slight smile. 'We were certainly together,' he said. 'Although I couldn't swear to the exact time she left, I stayed a little longer, drinking.' 'I understand,' said Poirot, without writing anything down. His memory, like an invisible net, had already caught the subtle contradictions. 'And you, monsieur?' he asked the next one, a young man with an angular face and a poorly tied tie. 'Julien Marchand, investor, or it was. The Baroness and I shared business, or disputes about them, rather. And were you in your room last night?' 'Yes, alone. I don't have an alibi. But no reason either,' he added with a tight smile. 'Delphine owed me money. If he dies, I lose everything.' 'Curious reasoning,' murmured Poirot. 'Some kill for inheritances, others for debts. Sometimes it's the same thing.' A figure in the corner, who had not said a word until now, broke the silence with a broken voice. I did see. Her last night everyone turned. She was a young woman with her hair tied up, dressed in a simple but neat outfit. He had his hands folded in his lap and his eyes were downcast. "Your name, mademoiselle?" "Geneviève Laroche, personal secretary of the baroness. He asked me to leave the mail in the suite, like every night. At 10:15 I came in, left the envelopes on his desk, and saw the bottle." "The bottle?" "Yeah, the one with the perfume. It was still closed. She held it in her hand as if she was intrigued. I remember he said something strange." "What did he say?" Geneviève swallowed. "An anonymous gift. What a delicious risk," he said. And he smiled. Poirot exchanged a fleeting glance with Morel. Then he took a step closer. "Mademoiselle, why have you kept that detail until now?" "I was afraid," he whispered. "Afraid that they would think I had brought it." "Did you do it?" "No," he stated more firmly now. "I didn't see who left her. It was just there, on the desk, along with the rest of the mail. As if someone had carefully placed it. Too careful." Poirot nodded slowly. The murderer wanted her to see him. Let him use it. It wasn't just about killing her, but about seducing her with the idea of doing so. He looked around. Everyone was silent. And without raising his voice, he said, "One of you knows who did it. Maybe everyone knows a part. My duty is to bring those parts together. But first, I must smell the crime from its roots." He turned elegantly. "Inspector, Morel, I want to see the Baroness's complete correspondence. Each envelope, every roll, and a detailed list of guests who arrived in the last 3 days." Chapter 3. The Letter That Had No Seal. The waves lapped gently on the Deauville coast as Poirot, with his freshly brushed gloves, sat at the desk in Suite 304, where the last traces of the poisoned perfume still floated. Next to it, a silver tray contained the letters the Baroness had received the night before. 6 envelopes in total. All open, all but one. This was the correspondence delivered yesterday, asked Poirot, without taking his eyes off the closed envelope. "Oui, monsieur," replied Geneviève, the secretary. "As always, I picked up everything at reception shortly before 10, and none of the envelopes have a clear address." Poirot murmured, slipping them one by one under his fingers. "However, this one," he held up the only closed one, "is different. The paper was thick, pale ivory, with an expensive texture. It had no stamp or return address, just the name, Delphine d'Aubrac, written in soft, almost affected handwriting." He held it a moment longer before breaking the seal with a precise gesture. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten in pale blue ink that seemed almost faded by time. Poirot read in silence. Then he carefully folded it again. "There are no threats, no confessions," he said, "but there is a hidden emotion, sadness, a kind of farewell, and a strangely formulated sentence. For such a perfect perfume, only a beautiful death would do justice." Morel frowned. "Do you think whoever wrote this is the murderer?" Poirot shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe someone else. Someone who warned what was coming. Or he wanted to be an emotional accomplice to the crime without executing it." He looked at the paper under the light. "Look at the fold, Inspector. It was not closed in a hurry. And yet the perfume did not stain the envelope, which indicates that the letter was not next to the jar at the time of its spill. Was it placed later? Exactly. Someone pushed her away. Someone knew what would happen. and didn't want this letter to get lost among the contaminated evidence. Poirot stood up and walked slowly around the room, delicately touching the back of a chair, the edge of the fireplace, the frame of the mirror. "There is an aesthetic will behind this crime," he murmured. "A composition, as if it were an act aimed not only at killing, but at impacting, to leave an indelible impression. And what kind of murderer cares about that?" Poirot smiled humorlessly. "A narcissist, inspector, or an artist." At that moment, the door opened with a sharp knock. A young man in a bellhop uniform entered, visibly nervous. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot. There is a guest who insists on talking to you. He says he has important information. It's in the hotel's greenhouse." Poirot exchanged a look with Morel. "Take me to her, please." The greenhouse of the Hôtel des Palmes was a warm oasis, filled with orchids, ferns, and tall palms filtering the evening light. Sitting next to a small fountain was a blonde woman in a coral dress. He held a closed fan as if it were a dagger. "Madame?" said Poirot as he approached. She looked up with a calculated gesture. "Yvonne Delmare. Perhaps you don't remember me, Monsieur Poirot. We crossed paths in Nice a few years ago, during the affair of the Viscount of Lomaine's necklace." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Of course, you were a key witness. I remember a phrase of his, 'Jewellery is not worth as much as what one pretends to have it.'" Yvonne smiled subtly. "I said it from my own experience. And what do you want to share this time?" "A warning, more than a piece of information," he said, lowering his voice. Delphine's death was not a surprise to some. Here, in this hotel, there are those who wanted her dead with almost poetic fervour. "Do you have names?" "Not yet. But I heard something last night near the music room. Someone was talking on the phone in a low voice. Said, 'After dawn, everything will be resolved with a fragrance.' Did you recognize the voice?" "No, but it was masculine, fine, educated, and he didn't talk like a murderer. He talked like he was playing a role." Poirot narrowed his eyes. A murderer with dramatic talent, or with experience in manipulating emotions. Yvonne nodded. That fits Delphine. He always chose young lovers, rotated assistants, humiliated with a smile. He had enemies, but he chose them delicately, as if selecting a poison. Poirot was silent for a moment, then, in a soft voice, "Did you love her?" Yvonne did not respond immediately. Then he closed the fan with a sharp click. "No, but I wanted to love her. And that is sometimes more dangerous." Poirot watched her go, her heels clicking on the marble. He was left alone among the orchids, his reflection multiplied in the windows. I knew the perfume was just the beginning. What killed the baroness was not in the jar, but in the intention behind it. Chapter 4. The Confessor of the Broken Picture. Night had fallen on Deauville with a soft rain that fogged up the windows of the Hôtel des Palmes. In Suite 304, Poirot was alone. The distant murmur of the sea mingled with the faint ticking of the bronze clock on the mantelpiece. It wasn't the kind of silence that was calming. It was one that demanded thought. The unsealed letter rested on his lap again. The final sentence, "Only a beautiful death would do justice." was turning in his mind like a key that still couldn't find the right lock. Poirot rose and walked towards the Baroness's dressing table. He looked closely at the bottles, each one arranged like perfumed soldiers in formation. Except one, an empty space right in the centre, the space where, without a doubt, the deadly perfume was placed. Someone knew exactly where to put it, so she would notice it, he murmured, so that it was the centre of their attention. Not an accident. A message, a knock on the door, brought him out of his reflection. It was Inspector Morel, with a tired expression and a damp handkerchief in his hand. We have questioned the cleaning staff, the night porter, the cooks. He sighed. Nobody saw anyone suspicious last night. But one of the waiters mentioned something strange. Yeah? He said he heard glass breaking in the next room, room 306, around 10:30. He didn't report anything because he thought it was part of some argument. It turns out that room is unoccupied. Unemployed? Who was the last guest? Morel consulted a small notebook. A certain Pierre Lenorme, painter. He left 2 nights ago. He said he would return to Paris, but left some of his luggage behind. He didn't come back to pick it up. Poirot raised an eyebrow. An artist who leaves his luggage did not plan to leave. He planned to disappear. The room is closed. We reviewed it superficially. But if you want— Yes, said Poirot, already, taking up his cane. Let's go right now. Room 306 smelled of turpentine and old linen. The curtains were closed, and a low lamp cast a yellow light on the central easel, above it a canvas covered by a white cloth. But what caught Poirot's attention was the frame on the floor, broken in 2, with a blurry imprint on one side. "What do you see, monsieur?" Morel asked, seeing Poirot bend down to examine the fracture. "A frame that didn't fall by accident. Look how it is broken diagonally. That happens when someone grabs it and hits it against something, strongly. And anger." Poirot removed the canvas from the easel. What he revealed left him silent for a moment. The painting showed an unfinished portrait. A woman in profile, sitting in front of a window. The face, barely sketched, was unmistakable. The Baroness Delphine d'Aubrac. Morel approached. He was painting it. No, Poirot corrected. He was watching her, analyzing. This is not just a portrait. It's a studio. Look how he has emphasized the shadows under the eyes. The hands, drawn with excessive detail, show anxiety, tension. And here he pointed to a more marked brushstroke on the collarbone. This is not a work to flatter. It is an emotional autopsy. Poirot picked up a small notebook from the floor, partially covered by the cloth. Opening it, he found sketches and scattered notes, but one page was underlined 3 times in red ink. When art is not enough, death completes the image. Mon Dieu, Morel murmured. Are you confessing? Not quite. You are stating your purpose, your vision. An artist who saw Delphine as an unfinished work, or like a mistake that needed to be corrected. Poirot closed his notebook and looked out the window into the puddled night. But what intrigues me is not what he wrote, but what he didn't finish. Why leave this portrait half done when everything else is so carefully orchestrated, disrupted? Poirot shook his head. No, he chose it that way. He wanted the portrait to be incomplete, as if the work could only be finished with his death. an invisible signature at dawn. Poirot examined the broken frame again. Then he looked around the room until he stopped at a small wooden box under the bed. Inside, he found several empty bottles, similar in shape to the perfume used in the crime, all without label. Artisanal production? Morel asked. Or recreations of a known fragrance? Essays, experiments. The artist was also a chemist, or had someone who assisted him. And that, Inspector, leads us to a new question. Did Pierre Lenormand act alone? A thought fleetingly crossed Poirot's mind. Or maybe it wasn't him who painted that picture. He stood up elegantly. Find Lenormand. If he's dead, I want his body. If he lives, I want his eyes. Because this crime, Inspector, was not impulsive. It was designed, like a theatre scene. And sometimes the author never sets foot on stage. Chapter 5. The Echo of the Fallen Curtain. The next morning, the Hôtel des Palmes resumed its pace with a tense calm. The guests ate breakfast in silence, and the usual murmur of china and spoons seemed muffled by something invisible. The crime still hung in the air like an unfinished melody. On the terrace of the dining room, Poirot watched the sea with his fingers intertwined on his cane. In front of him, an untouched tray with coffee and muffins. The detective had not eaten anything. Inspector Morel arrived with a folder in his hand and a frown more than usual. "News from Lenormand," he announced, taking a seat opposite Poirot. He was seen at the train station shortly before dawn 2 nights ago. No one has heard from him since. There are no records of his arrival in Paris. He has not removed his luggage, either, but something else. He slid the folder across the table. Poirot opened it with interest. Inside, a series of police documents, an old file. Pierre Lenormand, Poirot read in a low voice. Arrested 7 years ago for attempted arson. Emotionally unstable subject. Obsessive artist. Interned for a time in a psychiatric clinic and... He looked up. He met Delphine d'Aubrac in 1918. During an exhibition in Marseille, Morel completed. Apparently, she acquired one of his paintings. He became her patron for a brief period, until she fired him without explanation. Poirot closed the folder delicately. And thus, artistic resentment is born. A muse that abandons you can be more dangerous than a betrayed lover. But there is something that doesn't fit. He turned toward the horizon thoughtful. The crime scene has an intentional aesthetic, a theatricality. However, the broken frame does not harmonize. It is an act of anger, not composition. Do you think it was someone else? I don't know yet. But if Pierre was not the murderer, he was the instrument, or the perfect distraction. Poirot later requested that the suspects be brought together again, this time in the hotel's music room. A grand piano sat in the corner, and open windows let in the cold, salty air of the Atlantic. Claudine de Verreuil was the first to arrive, wearing a new hat and even darker glasses. Then Julien Marchand, with his usual nervousness camouflaged under a disdainful attitude. Geneviève Laroche sat in the back, her hands clasped in her lap. And finally, Yvonne Delmar, who arrived late with a calculatedly melancholy expression. Poirot remained standing by the piano. Mes amis, he began, I found something very interesting in room 306. an unfinished portrait of the Baroness Delphine d'Aubrac, made with precision but left incomplete, as if the artist had considered that the crime was the last necessary stroke. A dense silence settled in the room. What intrigues me is not the art, but its purpose. Was this a warning, a confession, or a signature? He looked directly at Julien Marchand. Monsieur, did you know Pierre Lenorme? By name, he answered. The Baroness mentioned it once, with disdain. He said his talent had rotted away in alcohol. And you, Madame de Verneuil? I saw him twice, at receptions hosted by Delphine. She enjoyed surrounding herself with tortured souls. It made him feel invincible. Poirot nodded slightly and then turned to Geneviève. And you, Mademoiselle Laroche? The young woman hesitated. Then he looked down. Yeah, I knew him. Secretly. He came sometimes at night. Through the back door of the hotel. Delphine didn't want to see it, but he insisted. He said he had to show him his latest creation. Morel stood up straight, surprised. And you didn't report it? I didn't want problems, and he didn't seem dangerous, just desperate. Poirot frowned slightly. Misdirected desperation can become very meticulous. Then he looked at Yvonne, who, until then, had remained silent. And you, Madame Delmare, you have nothing to add? She narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Because Pierre Lenorme was not a perfumer. He didn't have access to sophisticated poisons. But someone here did know enough about chemicals and fragrances. Someone who used to move in artistic circles, and also pharmacological ones. Are you accusing me? No, madame, said Poirot softly. I'm just pointing out that the perfume used as a weapon was manufactured with a precision that suggests technical knowledge. And you, in your younger years, worked in an essence laboratory in Grasse. You mentioned it yourself in an interview, published 3 years ago in the Perfume Gazette. Yvonne smiled, but her eyes did not. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. And that makes me a murderer. Why? I still don't know. But in a crime so carefully executed, every prior knowledge matters. And the killer didn't just need art, he needed chemistry. Poirot took a step towards the piano and placed his hand on the lid. Because this death was not impulsive, it was composed. He tapped a key softly. The note resonated, isolated in the room, like a score, and I'm still missing bars. His eyes lingered for a moment on the impassive face of Claudine de Verneuil. I thank you for your time, but I warn you, soon I will reunite you again, and by then I'll have the complete melody. Chapter 6. The Fragrance of a Forbidden Memory. That night, the sea roared louder. The wind blew through the hotel's windows like a restless whisper, and the gas lamp in the third-floor hallway flickered, casting shadows that lengthened on the walls like expectant figures. Poirot, as was his custom, had retired to his room early, but sleep did not come. Instead of resting, he paced slowly around the room, his hands clasped behind his back, and his thoughts dancing like unplaced chess pieces. On the table, Delphine's incomplete portrait, photographed by Morel before, being removed as evidence, lay next to the unstamped letter and a sheet of Poirot's calligraphic notes. Everything pointed towards an imminent truth, but still covered by the veil of incompleteness. At this moment, a discreet knock sounded on the door. Poirot opened the door. It was Geneviève Laroche, wrapped in a shawl. His eyes red. He was carrying a small crumpled handkerchief in his hand. "Sorry for the hour, Monsieur Poirot," he said in a dull voice. "But there is something I need to tell you, something I haven't had the courage to tell." Poirot nodded gently, inviting her in. "Mademoiselle, your silences weigh as much as lies. Take a seat, and tell me from the beginning, s'il vous plaît." Geneviève took a deep breath, clutching the handkerchief as if it were an amulet. "I was not only the Baroness's secretary, I was also his confidant, sometimes his shadow. I knew his secrets, and among them was Pierre Lenormand." Poirot sat opposite her, his expression neutral but expectant. "Delphine and Pierre," he continued, "had an affair years ago. Brief, but intense. He became obsessed. She got bored. She left him cruelly and forbade him from contacting her again. But Pierre never accepted it. He sent letters, flowers, and perfumes." "Perfumes?" Geneviève nodded. "He created them, or tried to imitate them." She used to laugh at that. He said that the aromas were his way of asking for forgiveness, or begging for revenge. "And the bottle from last night? I can't prove that he sent it, but I recognize the bottle. The design is identical to one she returned unopened 3 years ago. He saved it. I don't know why. Maybe out of vanity, or out of nostalgia." Poirot leaned slightly towards her. "And why didn't you mention this before?" Geneviève looked down. "Because I thought that if I did, they would blame me. Pierre kept writing to me. I was his only bridge. But it's been months since I heard more. Until last night, when I saw the bottle." Poirot remained silent for a few seconds. "Mademoiselle," he said finally, "your words do not condemn you. But they raise a new fog over this crime. Because if you were that bridge, maybe someone else used that link." He stood up, walking slowly towards the window. Such a delicate crime cannot be based solely on passions. Need opportunity. You need access, and above all, knowledge of the victim's soul. He turned to her. "One last question. Did the Baroness read all his letters? No, just the ones that intrigued him. I selected. Sometimes he hid them. And the letter without a seal? I don't recognize that one. It's not Pierre's, nor from anyone regular. But," he frowned, "the handwriting looks familiar." "Familiar how? Like something read in another context, in a book, or maybe in a manuscript." Poirot narrowed his eyes. An idea germinated in his mind, a vague idea, still without form, but with a clear aroma, that of literature in disguise. The next morning, Poirot walked to the hotel library. There, among dusty shelves and worn leather armchairs, he met Claudine de Verreuil. She was leafing through a volume with a bored expression, but when she saw him enter, she closed the book and smiled slowly. "Monsieur Poirot, are you also looking for answers between the pages?" "Sometimes books say more than men," he answered, approaching. "I was wondering, have you recently published any novels?" "Yes," he answered, raising an eyebrow. "The Crystal Orchid, a story of betrayal, art, and revenge, very poorly understood by critics. Oh, what a shame! But do you include anonymous letters in that work?" Claudine stared at him for a second. Then he smiled icy. "Funny that you ask. There is a key scene in which an unsigned letter anticipates a crime, a classic narrative device. Do you suspect that fiction has invaded reality? I don't rule it out, madam. Sometimes perpetrators get ahead of their own crimes without knowing it." Poirot took another step. "Or they plan them through their words, hoping that someone will read them as a warning or as a confession." Claudine closed her book without, taking her eyes off Poirot. "I write tragedies, monsieur. I don't execute them." Poirot smiled politely. "Maybe, but we still don't know who wrote the final scene of this tragedy." He left the library, leaving behind him the faint impression that, for the first time, Claudine had blinked before him. Chapter 7. The Manuscript with Changed Date. The morning progressed between low clouds and a sea mist that seemed to want to hide more than it revealed. In the main hall of the Hôtel des Palmes, Poirot was slowly leafing through a copy of The Crystal Orchid, the most recent novel by Claudine de Vereuil. He had discreetly requested it from the front desk, and was going through it page by page, not like a reader, but like an investigator looking for traces in a crime scene disguised as fiction. On page 147 he stopped. There it was. For such a perfect perfume, only a beautiful death would do justice. The same phrase, written in the anonymous letter that accompanied the poison bottle. The same words, the same structure. Without quotes, it wasn't a date, it was a line from the narrator, or the author. And that, in a novel published 3 months before the crime, could not be a coincidence. Poirot closed the book slowly. The echo of that phrase in the letter was not an inspiration. It was a signature. Shortly afterwards, Poirot went to the hotel reception, where the receptionist, a nervous young man, was consulting the register book with obvious concern. "Monsieur Poirot, can I help? You?" "Indeed, young man. I need to see the entry form signed by Madame Claudine de Vereuil. I want to confirm your exact arrival date." "Of course," he said, flipping through with clumsy fingers. "Here it is. It arrived on Wednesday, 4 days ago." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Are you safe?" "Yes, I remember it well." "He arrived in the middle of the afternoon. He asked that his room have natural light so he could write." Poirot nodded. "And now, show me the signed form." The receptionist handed it to him. Poirot examined him carefully. The name was written with a fountain pen, elegant handwriting, but there was something else, something tiny. A barely visible scratch next to the date. The number 2 barely stood out under the 3. Poirot ran his fingernail gently over it. A minimal residue of different ink. A correction done skillfully, but not enough to escape his eyes. "This form was altered," he murmured. "How do you say?" Poirot looked up. Claudine de Vereuil arrived at the hotel a day earlier than appears here. On Tuesday, not on Wednesday, and that changes many things. Minutes later, Poirot appeared at the door of room 207. He knocked softly. Claudine opened it with a curiously calm expression. He was wearing a light grey velvet robe and was holding a steaming cup of tea. "Monsieur Poirot, have you come for another literary date?" I have come for a date, and for one sentence he entered without waiting for an invitation. She closed the door slowly. I don't usually get visited this early. I guess you didn't come to praise my novel. I have come to ask you why a line from your novel appears word for word in an anonymous letter found next to the Baroness's body. Claudine looked at him unfazed. He sipped his tea. Are you sure it's the same phrase? As sure as I am about my moustache. She put the cup on the table. It's a literary coincidence. It wouldn't be the first time that reality imitates art, Monsieur Poirot narrowed his eyes, or the first time that an author turns reality into an extension of his work. A slight silence settled. We know that you arrived on Tuesday, not Wednesday. Someone altered the date in the record, and only someone who had something to hide would do something so clumsy and at the same time so carefully subtle. Claudine crossed her arms. Are you accusing me? I'm asking questions, madam. And you respond with the language of those who write endings, but do not explain. Beginnings. What did you do on Tuesday night? I was in my room, writing. Can someone confirm it? No. And if you could, you'd say I'm lying, right? Poirot took a step towards the window, the grey light barely illuminating his profile. You wrote that phrase, not now, months ago. But that letter wasn't written months ago. It was written days ago, or last night. That means that the author of the letter knew his novel, and he decided to use his language. Or you wrote it yourself, like a premeditated echo, to turn a crime into literature, or literature as an alibi. Claudine did not respond. He just picked up the cup of tea again. His hand this time was barely trembling. Poirot turned to her. Did you love the Baroness? Pause. No, but I admired her. It was cruel, yes, but fascinating. Like a jewel that cuts, like a weapon that shines. And that makes her a muse, or a target. Claudine closed her eyes for a moment. Delphine never thought that her games would have consequences. He never believed that someone with less power could have the last word. Poirot bowed slightly. Madam, be careful. Sometimes writing about a crime is not the same as telling about it, and readers always notice when a story smacks too much of the truth. Back in his room, Poirot placed all the elements of the case back on the table. The perfume, the letter, the line in the novel, the altered date. And then he felt it, an invisible connection. A figure in the shadows, someone who hadn't said enough yet, or had said just enough to appear innocent. Everything was in its place, but there was still one last note missing, one more piece. And then the curtain would fall. Chapter 8. The Imprint of the Invisible Fingers. The afternoon had turned leaden. A grey blanket descended over the coast, as if the sky, tired of observing in silence, wanted to close its eyes for a moment. At the Hôtel des Palmes, guests avoided the lobby, as if they knew something was coming, something that couldn't be avoided. Poirot, on the other hand, seemed more active than ever. He walked the corridors with a measured step, stopping at certain points with the same precision with which one observes a chess board about to close. He went up to the third floor. He stopped in front of a small decorative display case in the hallway, just visible to the right of Suite 304. There, unnoticed for days, a tiny glass bell had sat on a ceramic plate. Poirot leaned forward, examining the bell carefully. The glass was almost clean, except for a light film of dust, and a tiny, almost imperceptible mark just on the bottom edge, a partial fingerprint. He smiled. Half an hour later, in the reading room, Poirot met Inspector Morel, who was waiting for him with a tired expression barely concealed by curiosity. "A footprint on a decorative bell?" Morel repeated skeptically. "I don't think anyone would bother touching it. How important can it be?" "Ah, mon ami, that is precisely what is interesting. That display case is located right in front of the door to the Baroness's suite. It doesn't attract attention, but if someone leaned on it when entering or leaving, if they stopped to listen or to place something on the floor without being seen from inside, they would have left a mark, an invisible trace, until you know where to look for it." Morel frowned. "Are you implying that the murderer waited outside the room?" "A possibility. But there is something else. That display case was cleaned 3 days ago by the staff. After that, no one has come close, except one person." Poirot opened a small notebook and handed it to him. A list of the personnel who accessed that hallway, and of the guests who passed through it. All but one were registered by the tea service or the bellboy. Everyone except Yvonne Delmare. Morel raised an eyebrow. "Are you safe? More than that, I am convinced. Because also, I have confirmed an interesting detail. The deadly perfume, that handmade bottle that killed the Baroness, cannot have been made by Pierre Lenormand. But I had the bottles. Yeah, empty jars, containers. No chemical knowledge. Preliminary analysis of the liquid in the bottle revealed a base of jasmine oil synthesized with compounds used in fine perfumery, mixed with a prussic acid derivative in stable suspension. That doesn't make an amateur artist. It is done by someone with practice, with experience, like Yvonne." Poirot nodded. "She worked for years in Grasse. He is a specialist in aromatic fixatives. And what catches my attention the most is that she was the one who, in our conversation in the greenhouse, mentioned a phrase that later appeared in the letter without a seal. The same phrase, exactly the same. Although he tried to attribute it to a conversation overheard on the phone." Morel crossed her arms. "And what do we do? Shall we confront her?" Poirot shook his head. "Not yet. She is skilled. It has hidden behind enigmatic phrases and half-truths. But he can no longer hide the essential thing. His footprints are where they shouldn't be. And his words, too." He paused. "I need to see her one more time. This time with everyone else present." In the evening, Poirot requested a final meeting. All guests related to the case were summoned to the first-floor lounge. Nobody asked why. Everyone knew that the answer was close. Claudine de Vereuil arrived with her impenetrable elegance. Julien Marchand seemed even more nervous than usual, sweating under the collar of his shirt. Geneviève Laroche arrived in silence, head down. Yvonne Delmare was the last to enter. She wore an ivory dress with gold details. He was smiling, but his eyes were sharp. Poirot stood in the centre, next to the piano. Mesdames et messieurs, he began in a firm voice, the tragedy has been interpreted. The curtain is about to fall. And now, let me show you the invisible threads of this deadly theatre. He walked slowly between them. Baroness Delphine d'Aubrac was murdered with poisoned perfume, contained in a handmade glass bottle. This bottle was not a simple anonymous submission. It was a careful aesthetic construction, signed with style, but not with a name, with aroma. He turned to Claudine. You, madam, wrote the phrase that later appeared in the letter, but he did not write it a second time. Then to Julien. You had the economic motive, but not the mind to design such an aesthetically meticulous crime. Finally, his eyes landed on Yvonne. But you, Madame Delmare, you had everything, chemical, knowledge, the access, experience in handling fragrances, the ability to create a deadly perfume, and a reason. A silent, deeply personal reason. Rejection. Yvonne smiled, still calm. What an elegant narrative, Monsieur Poirot. It is not a narrative, madame. It is a deduction. Evidence-based. His partial fingerprint was found in the glass case in front of the Baroness's suite, and the chemical tests on the perfume match the formulas used in his former laboratory in Grasse. Everything indicates that you were there, the exact moment when death was served with aroma. The silence was absolute. For a moment, then Yvonne let out a light laugh. And all because of a fingerprint on a glass? No, madam, because of a contradiction in her perfume. His and the one who killed Delphine. They both share a base note. Unmistakable. Yvonne closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't deserve to die, but it did deserve to remember. Remember what you left behind. Poirot nodded solemnly, and so he did, with his last breath, because a perfume, madam, is not just a smell. It is memory, and his was deadly. Chapter 9. The Reason It Didn't. Smell Like Revenge. The room remained silent for a long time after Poirot's last statement. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The carefully formulated accusation against Yvonne Delmare had fallen over the room like a thick fog, enveloping every corner. Yvonne remained standing, serene. He didn't protest. He didn't cry. He looked at Poirot as if, in the depths of his soul, he had been waiting for this moment. The crackling of faint wood in the fireplace seemed the only sound allowed to exist. I figured it would end up like this, he said finally, his voice low, firm. After all, I'm the only one with a useful past, right? The only one with the necessary skills. But you are wrong about something, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot raised an eyebrow, interested. Oh, yes, yeah. He thinks this was revenge. That I killed Delphine because she humiliated me in the past. But it wasn't hate that brought me here. It was compassion. There was a slight movement among those present. Claudine frowned. Julien shifted in his seat. Geneviève swallowed. Compassion? Poirot repeated without altering his tone. Yvonne nodded slowly. Delphine was dying. Maybe you didn't know it, but I do. Cancer, advanced, inevitable. He confessed it to me one night, during one of our rare honest conversations. He told me without tears, without drama. only with that theatrical air that defined her. "I want my last appearance to be perfect." Poirot watched her attentively without interrupting. She didn't want hospitals. She didn't want to be reduced. Wanted a clean, elegant, unforgettable ending. I thought he wasn't serious. But then I received your letter." Yvonne took out a small aged envelope from her purse. "The letter you read, the one that appeared next to the jar, was not anonymous. It was his, in his own handwriting. I just delivered it as he asked me." Poirot stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the envelope. "You say it was Delphine who wrote the letter?" "Yeah, it was part of the ritual, a final scene. She designed everything. I just wore the perfume. I prepared it as she instructed me, not knowing at first that she would use it on herself." Morel, standing by the fireplace, approached, and "You expect us to believe that it was the baroness who planned her own death and asked you for help?" "I'm not interested in being believed. I know what happened, and Delphine knew it too." Poirot took the envelope delicately. He examined it. The handwriting was identical to that which appeared in other private notes of the baroness, which Poirot had had the opportunity to review thanks to Geneviève. There was no doubt it had been written by her, and yet... "And why didn't you say it before, Madame Delmar?" "Because she made me promise not to intervene, that I would let everything happen naturally. I wanted a scandalous ending, an unsolved crime, that his death caused a stir, comments, like everything he did in life. And you obeyed." "Yeah." Poirot approached the fire and stared into the flickering flame. His voice, when he spoke, was lower, more personal. Madame Delphine was many things. Vain, cruel, charming, but also deeply fearful of decay. The face of oblivion was his true enemy, and he feared that death without witnesses would be his real disappearance. He turned to those present. "And yet, there is still something that doesn't fit. Because if all this was his will, if he prepared his death, why make it look like a murder? Why implicate those around her? Why drag innocent people into this final theatre?" Yvonne was silent for a few seconds. Then he looked up, without hesitation, because that was Delphine. She could never exist without an audience, not even in death. Poirot narrowed his eyes as if something at that moment was finally falling into place. "Ah, then, voilà. That explains everything. The fact that," Morel asked, "that this crime, although executed with poison, was not motivated by hatred, but by vanity. A perfectly staged death. But someone, Inspector, took advantage of that scenario. Someone who did have hate." Everyone looked at him. "Are you saying there were two authors? One who planned her death, and another who used her as cover for another purpose? An original letter, yes, but a manipulated replica. A bottle that should have been harmless, and was adulterated, because someone made sure that Delphine died that night, not by agreement, but by elimination." Poirot turned slowly on his heel. "And that someone is still among us." A silence deeper than the previous ones descended on the room. And in that silence, for the first time since the beginning, Geneviève Laroche raised her head, and his eyes. They weren't just sad anymore. They were guilty. Chapter 10. the silence that nobody heard. The tension thickened like an invisible veil as Geneviève Laroche finally raised her head. His face was no longer hidden behind shadows of shyness or respect. In his eyes was a mix of pain, determination, and something harder to decipher: relief. Poirot did not look away. "Mademoiselle Laroche," he said, his voice low and direct, "is there anything you would like to tell us?" Geneviève swallowed. In her lap, their hands were clasped tightly. "I didn't mean for it to come to this," he whispered. "I didn't mean for her to die like this." They all turned towards her with different expressions. Julien Marchand, incredulous. Claudine, expressionless. Yvonne, completely still. Poirot remained standing, as if he already knew what he was going to hear. "Say it," he asked softly. "Tell us the missing part." Geneviève closed her eyes for a moment. Then he spoke. "It is true that Delphine planned her own death, that he asked Yvonne for the perfume. I saw the letter. I was the one who kept it next to the jar, just like she asked me to. It was his farewell. I wanted it to look tragic, theatrical. And then, so," Geneviève whispered, "I took the bottle." A muffled murmur ran through the room. "I didn't replace it. I did not alter its content. I just watched it. For hours. I thought, if I take it back, I save her. If I leave it, I lose her. And I didn't do anything. Nothing. I knew what would happen. But I didn't have the courage to intervene." Poirot frowned softly. "But that's not what tortures her, is it? It's not what he didn't do. That's what he did." After Geneviève trembled. A tear rolled down her cheek. The bottle that Yvonne prepared was harmless. A sharp silence fell like a blade. "What does it say?" said Morel, coming forward. "Delphine knew it. I didn't really want to die. Just scare, move, cause a stir. The poison was an illusion, an inert mixture. I wasn't going to kill her, but—" Poirot took a step towards her without raising his voice. "You replaced him." Geneviève nodded, barely. "I had access to a real sample, a substance that she kept under lock and key, as if it were a relic from another life. He showed it to me once, as a warning. Never use it, he told me. But that night I opened the harmless jar, emptied it, and replaced it. I measured each drop. I sealed it, carefully. Neither Yvonne nor anyone else noticed." "Because?" asked Poirot in a whisper, almost hurt. "Why do something so irreversible? Because I hated her as much as I loved her." Genevieve's voice no longer trembled. She was enveloped in icy clarity. For years he had me by his side, not like the same, not as a friend, as property. He used me, he manipulated me, he despised me. He made me believe that I mattered, that he needed me. But it was all a lie. He made me feel like someone, only to later remind me that I wasn't. He turned to the others. I saw how he played with all of you, how he humiliated in silence, how he smiled as he dragged people into his games. And when he told me he would fake his death with fake poison, something in me broke. Geneviève looked directly at Poirot. So I decided I wasn't going to pretend, that for once I wouldn't control the ending, that I would have the last word. A silence settled, dense, impenetrable. No one seemed to know how to move or react, until Poirot broke the stillness. "It was you, then. the only one who knew the real plan, and took it one step further. Geneviève did not deny, "I am not an impulse murderer, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't suffocate her. I didn't push her down a staircase. I didn't stab her in a fit of jealousy. I let his lie become the truth, that their drama ended in tragedy." Poirot looked down, thoughtful, and so he did, with almost theatrical accuracy. "But don't forget this, mademoiselle. Although your gesture was silent, your intention screamed. There is no crime without decision, and his was premeditated, accurate, lethal." Geneviève did not protest. He only murmured, "I know." Morel stepped forward, handcuffs in hand, but Poirot raised a hand. "Hope!" He approached Geneviève slowly. "Tell me something, please. Why now? Why confess it today?" "Because when I saw Yvonne take the blame, when I saw her eyes, I understood that my silence was also a form of cruelty, and I've lived with that for quite some time." Poirot nodded gravely. "Thank you for saying it. It doesn't change what happened, but it does make sense." He turned to Morel. "Now, yes, Inspector." Geneviève stood up without resistance. As she was escorted out, the room was enveloped in a strange emptiness. Claudine stood up silently. Julien avoided everyone's gaze. Yvonne watched the fireplace, motionless. Poirot, for his part, walked slowly to the window. The sea rose on the horizon, rough and cold, like the truth. "In the end," he murmured, "it wasn't the poison that killed Delphine. It was the arrogance of believing he controlled all emotions, and the mistake of underestimating those that didn't make noise." Chapter 11. The Roses That Did Not Lose Their Perfume. The next day dawned with a clear sky, as if the night wind had swept away the last remains of the storm, and, with it, part of the enigma that had enveloped the Hôtel des Palmes. Still, between the marble corridors and the rooms bathed in sunlight, the atmosphere was still permeated with what Poirot called the invisible residue of crime, that intangible weight that does not disappear with arrests or confessions. On the hotel terrace, the flower boxes were full of newly opened roses. White, pink, crimson, a detail that did not go unnoticed by Poirot, who walked slowly among them with his hands crossed behind his back and an expression of deep thought. It was there that Claudine de Véreuil found him. "Monsieur Poirot," he said softly, without irony. "Ah, this time. Can I accompany you?" Poirot greeted her with a slight bow of his head. "Of course, madam. Roses, like words, are always enjoyed more in good company." Claudine walked beside him for a few meters, in silence. "So, it was Geneviève," he finally said. "He always seemed so invisible, so docile." "The quietest people," answered Poirot, "are often those who guard the mightiest rivers." She nodded, but didn't smile. "And yet, it's not her who worries me, it's Delphine." Poirot cocked his head. "Madame." Claudine stopped in front of a pale rose bush. "You said that the baroness planned her death as a dramatic act, that he faked his end to turn it into a spectacle. But I believe that she never stopped manipulating, not even in that way." Poirot did not answer. He let her continue. "I knew Geneviève better than anyone. I knew what his silence was hiding. I knew I was at my limit, and still he gave him the bottle. He included it in his final work, as if he wanted to push her, force her to act. Do you think she wanted to die, but also be murdered? Claudine turned her gaze towards Poirot, serious. I think Delphine didn't want a controlled death. He wanted one last humiliation, even in his departure. Let someone else take the blame, with the weight that someone would cry for her, not out of love, but because she had fallen into their game. Poirot looked at the rose in front of him. Its petals were perfect, without a single spot. He touched her gently. Sometimes, madame, the most intoxicating perfume is also the most poisonous. Hours later, Poirot returned to the Baroness's room. Although the forensics had taken everything essential, small traces remained. The shadow of a bottle on the dresser, a forgotten note in a dresser drawer, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials D. Poirot stopped in front of the mirror. He watched him in silence. So much effort, he murmured, to leave an image. For maintaining control even at the end. But the real mirror, Madame Delphine, was Geneviève. And you looked at yourself in it, and what he saw was the wound he left. He walked towards the window. Outside, the sea breeze rustled the curtains. The air was clean, almost new. It was then that Morel appeared in the doorway, papers in her hand. "Good news," he said. "Geneviève's confession has been accepted as a voluntary statement. We'll cooperate with the investigation. He didn't run away. He didn't lie. He didn't try to hide. Maybe the court will take that into account." Poirot nodded slowly. That, and the fact that she wasn't the one who set the stage. He just changed the script. And what about Yvonne Delmer? He is free from direct suspicion, although he must answer for having collaborated in the initial farce. Delphine manipulated her masterfully, like everyone. Morel sighed. The witchy complexity of the human soul never ceases to amaze me. How many forms a crime can take, even without visible weapons. That is precisely why, said Poirot, turning to look at him, I prefer my little grey cells to a magnifying glass. Logic, Inspector, reveals what emotion tries to hide. That night before leaving, Poirot paid one last visit. At the back of the hotel, where a small private garden stood the test of time, he found Geneviève. Sitting on an iron bench, she was wearing simple clothes. His eyes, although tired, no longer avoided the world. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted, in a low voice. I thought he had already left. Not yet. Not without saying goodbye. Not without leaving one last reflection, if you allow me. She nodded. Poirot sat down next to him. You said you didn't do anything, that he just let the poison do what it had to do. But really, what he did was take control, something I had never had, and that justifies me. Poirot shook his head slowly. No, but it explains it, and justice, mademoiselle, does not always punish. Sometimes observe and remember. She looked down. I don't know if I will ever forgive myself. Poirot looked at her with a tenderness he rarely showed. Sometimes living with what we did is the only necessary punishment, but also the only way to change. He stood up, adjusting his coat. The roses of this hotel still perfume the air. Some survive even in winter. Maybe you can do it too." And without further words, he left. The wind caressed the flowers, and among them some petals fell, but others, firm, resisted. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. The Baroness's Last Perfume. The morning of the last day in Deauville dawned with a serene blue, without clouds, as if the sky had waited for everything to be resolved before it could breathe again. Poirot, impeccably dressed, descended the stairs of the Hôtel des Palmes with his small suitcase in his hand, his shoes shining with exact polish, and his moustache perfectly symmetrical. Inspector Morel was waiting for him in the lobby, coffee in hand and a thoughtful expression. "A march already, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oui, Inspector. There is nothing more to deduce. The crime has been solved. The wounds, those will take longer." Morel nodded. "I confess that I still don't know how to define this case. Murder? Manipulated? Suicide? A play with too many actors?" Poirot smiled slightly. "A tragedy in 5 acts, with a dead author, a deceived accomplice, and a victim who never thought that the scenario would collapse with her in it." He approached the reception desk and left a closed letter. He directed her to Geneviève Laroche. "One last piece of advice," he said without giving details. "And what does the letter say?" Morel asked in a curious tone. "Just one question," answered Poirot. "Who were you before she overshadowed you?" In the train carriage, Poirot took a seat by the window. As the locomotive chugged, he began to write in his personal notebook. It was not for the police nor for the press. It was just for him. A habit of his, recording the most delicate truths that were rarely said out loud. Baroness. Delphine d'Aubrac did not die just from poison. She died from the slow accumulation of all the silences she caused. Her crime was to live as if the world were a mirror that always returned her image. But mirrors can break and reflect something else. In the end, her death was the only time she allowed others to have the focus. Poirot looked up when he heard the station bell fade in the distance. Outside, the green fields and country roads passed like a sigh. I didn't feel satisfaction, just a slight sadness. Like when one discovers that the truth, although accurate, does not always bring peace. As the train left the coast at the Hôtel des Palmes, Geneviève Laroche opened the letter, sitting in the backyard, the same iron bench, the same silence. He read the words and felt something he hadn't felt in days. Not relief, not forgiveness, but yes, an address, a seed. He got up and walked towards the roses. He observed them. He didn't cut them. He didn't touch them. He just looked at them. Maybe, he thought, the time had come to not be just the shadow of another. Stop being the one who obeyed, of being the one who acted only when someone else asked her to finally be someone with your own voice. 2 weeks later, in Paris, a small article appeared in an independent perfume magazine. No signature, faceless. It was a thoughtful column about the emotional power of scents, about how perfumes hold our deepest memories, and how sometimes a fragrance can take us closer to the truth than any words. In her last line, the anonymous author wrote, "Some roses open on their own, without needing a garden to applaud them. They just need to stop hiding their scent." In his London apartment, Poirot received an envelope with no return address. Inside, a tiny bottle of perfume, sealed, with a grey bow. It didn't have a label. He opened the bottle carefully and smelled its contents. The aroma was delicate, jasmine, bergamot, and a light background of sandalwood. Warm, persistent, human. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. "Non, it's not revenge," he murmured. "It is freedom." He placed the jar next to his collection of curious objects from past cases, not as evidence, but as a memory, a perfume that didn't kill. One who, for the first time, told the truth.